In 2023, a viral incident shook the internet. A police officer in a moment, fueled by prejudice, pointed a gun at the beloved Hollywood actor Keanu Reeves during a casual stop in Los Angeles. What unfolded next not only cost the officer his badge but unveiled a deeply personal and emotional story about Keanu's quiet, life-changing kindness years earlier, a kindness that the officer himself had unknowingly experienced. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. It was an unusually cold evening in January 2023 when Keanu Reeves, dressed in his signature unassuming manner, a simple leather jacket and jeans, was driving down Sunset Boulevard in his vintage motorcycle. He had just wrapped up a charity event supporting underprivileged children. A cause was close to his heart. As he approached a red light, the wail of police sirens pierced the quiet night, and a patrol car signaled him to pull over. License and registration barked. Officer Mark Reynolds, a man in his late 40s with a hardened expression. Mark had been on the force for over 2 decades. But recent years had been challenging. A bitter divorce, custody battles, and financial struggles had left him cynical, and his frustrations often spilled into his work. Keanu calmly removed his helmet, revealing his recognizable face, but instead of de-escalating the situation, the officer's prejudice flared up. Step out of the vehicle, Mark ordered, his tone sharp and accusatory. As Keanu complied, keeping his hands visible, Mark's fingers tightened on his holstered gun. The next moments were a blur. Witnesses later recounted how Mark, agitated and on edge, pulled his weapon and pointed it directly at Keanu. Gasps filled the air as a small crowd began to gather, some recording the scene with their phones. Keanu, remarkably calm, raised his hands slightly. "Officer, I'm unarmed, let's talk this through," he said softly, his voice steady but edged with concern. But what no one, not even Keanu, could anticipate was how this encounter would unravel. As Mark's superior arrived on the scene, the body cam footage was reviewed, and within minutes the officer was ordered to stand down. The department moved swiftly, placing Mark on immediate suspension. The incident went viral overnight, igniting debates about systemic issues in law enforcement. What no one knew yet was the incredible twist hidden in Mark's past. Unbeknownst to him, years earlier, a random act of kindness by Keanu had saved Mark's family during one of their darkest times, and as the media frenzy intensified, this truth slowly began to emerge, shaking Mark to his core. The days following the incident were a whirlwind. News channels buzzed with the story. Clips of the encounter flooded social media, and Mark Reynolds found himself at the center of a national controversy. The once proud officer now sat alone in his small, dimly lit apartment, scrolling through endless headlines. Each article condemned his actions, calling him everything from unfit to serve to outright racist. He couldn't deny it. He'd been on edge that night, overwhelmed by the weight of his crumbling life. But what he couldn't explain was why the face of the man he'd wronged lingered so vividly in his mind. Keanu Reeves, the name seemed so familiar, yet distant, as though tied to a memory he couldn't quite grasp. Meanwhile, Keanu, true to his nature, had remained quiet about the incident while the world raged. In his defense, he focused on something deeper. He'd seen the look in Mark's eyes that night. It wasn't just anger, it was pain, and Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than the world was seeing. A week later, Mark received an unexpected phone call. It was from the precinct, informing him that Keanu Reeves had chosen not to press charges. Mark was stunned. Why would the man he'd humiliated, the man he'd endangered, choose mercy? But the surprises didn't end there. 2 days later, Mark received a letter, no sender, no return address, just a plain envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mark, sometimes the pain we carry makes us act in ways we don't recognize. I've been there too. I hope you find peace." Keanu. Mark read the letter over and over, each word cutting deeper than the last. He didn't deserve this kindness, this understanding, not after what he'd done. But as the days passed, the letter stayed on his kitchen table, a silent Reminder that forgiveness, though undeserved, was a gift still haunted by the feeling of familiarity. Mark couldn't let it go. Late one night he found himself digging through old photo albums, desperate to uncover the connection, and then he found it, a picture from nearly a decade ago. It was a grainy snapshot of his late wife Susan smiling with their daughter at a children's hospital. Standing beside them holding a stack of gifts was Keanu Reeves. Mark's breath caught in his throat, memories flooded back. It was Christmas Eve 9 years ago. Susan had been battling terminal cancer, and they couldn't afford the experimental treatment that might have given her more time. That night a stranger had come to the hospital, handing out gifts and paying medical bills anonymously. Mark had never known his name until now. The realization hit like a tidal wave. Keanu had been there for his family when they needed it most, and Mark had repaid him with cruelty. Overwhelmed by guilt and gratitude, Mark knew he couldn't stay silent. He needed to make amends, not just for Keanu but for himself. And so for the first time in years, Mark made a choice. He packed the letter into his pocket, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the cold night air. He had no plan, no clear destination, just the hope that somehow he could find the man who had shown him the meaning of grace and redemption. Mark's heart pounded as he drove through the city, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The letter sat full folded in his jacket pocket close to his chest. He didn't know where Keanu lived, nor did he know if he'd even get the chance to speak with him, but he was determined to try. The guilt was suffocating. Every moment replayed in his mind, the way he shouted, the way his hand had hovered over his gun, and the quiet, composed look in Keanu's eyes that night. The same man who had unknowingly saved his family from complete despair was the one he had treated like a criminal. Mark needed to say something, to explain, to apologize, to thank him. After hours of searching, Mark finally arrived at a modest, secluded home on the outskirts of the city. A tip from an old friend in the precinct had led him here. He parked his car and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the dimly lit windows. His pulse raced. What could he even say? Would Keanu even listen? Summoning his courage, Mark stepped out of the car and walked up the narrow path to the door. The air was crisp, his breath visible in the cold night. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated. What if this was a mistake? What if he was intruding? Before he could second guess himself further, the door opened. Standing there was Keanu, wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, his hair slightly tousled as if he'd just woken up. His expression was calm but curious, his dark eyes straight studying Mark for a moment before recognition flickered across his face. Mark stumbled over his words. Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry for coming here unannounced. I needed to see you. Keanu stepped aside, motioning for Mark to come in. Without a word, the gesture caught Mark off guard. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, but instead he was met with quiet acceptance. Inside the house was warm and inviting, filled with books, art, and a lived-in charm. It wasn't the lavish mansion Mark had imagined a celebrity might own. It felt human. Keanu offered him a seat, and after a moment of silence he spoke. I figured you'd come, Keanu said softly, his voice steady but kind. Mark's eyes widened. You did? Keanu nodded. You had that look, the kind of pain that doesn't let you rest until you face it. The words hit Mark harder than he expected. His voice cracked as he tried to respond. I don't even know where to start. That night I acted out of anger, out of prejudice. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am. Keanu listened intently, his expression unreadable. Mark continued, pulling the old photo from his pocket and placing it on the table between them. This was you, Mark said, his voice shaking. N years ago you were there for my wife and daughter when I couldn't be. You paid for her treatment, gave us one more Christmas together. I never knew who you were until now. I can't believe His voice broke and he looked down ashamed. Keanu picked up the photo, a faint smile touching his lips as he remembered that Christmas Eve. I didn't do it for recognition, he said gently. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Tears welled in Mark's eyes. And I betrayed that kindness. I pointed a gun at you. I let my own pain turn me into Someone I don't recognize. How do you even forgive someone like me? Keanu leaned back, his gaze thoughtful. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook, it's about letting go of the weight we carry. You're here now, facing it. That takes strength. The room fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Mark Shy trembled as years of buried grief and guilt finally poured out. Keanu didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened, his presence steady and grounding. For the first time in years, Mark felt a glimmer of hope, as though the crushing weight on his chest was beginning to lift. He knew this was just the beginning, but he also knew he wasn't alone anymore, and somewhere in the quiet, the seeds of redemption began to take root. The two men sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. For Mark, the quiet was both painful and necessary. He had spent years running from his emotions, drowning them in anger and bitterness. And now here he was face to face with the one person who had shown him kindness in his darkest hour. Keanu finally broke the silence, his voice calm but piercing. You know, pain has a way of either breaking us or building us. It's clear yours has been tearing you apart. Mark nodded, his throat tightening. I don't even know who I've become after my wife passed. Everything fell apart. My daughter stopped talking to me, and I threw myself into my job thinking it would distract me, but it didn't. It only made me colder, angrier. Keen leaned forward, his eyes soft but unflinching. Grief does that, it isolates us, makes us feel like we're alone, but you're not alone, Mark. You weren't then, and you're not now. Tears burned in Mark's eyes as he looked down at his hands. I thought I was doing everything right, serving my community, protecting people, but somewhere along the way I lost sight of what mattered. I let my own pain make me bitter, and that night I saw you, and instead of seeing a person I saw someone to blame, someone to take my anger out on. I don't even know how to fix this. Keanu sat back, his expression contemplative. You start by forgiving yourself, and then you do better. You can't change the past, but you can choose how you move forward. The words hit Mark like a revelation. Forgive himself. He'd never considered it. His entire life had been about holding himself to impossible standards, punishing himself for every mistake. But now, sitting in the presence of someone who had every reason to hate him, and didn't, he wondered if it was possible. Keanu stood and walked over to a bookshelf, pulling out a worn journal. He handed it to Mark. This helped me once. I wrote down everything I was feeling, no matter how messy or painful it was. It gave me clarity. Maybe it'll help you too. Mark took the journal, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Keanu offered a small reassuring smile. It's not too late, Mark, for anything. As Mark left that night, the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring past him, lost in thought. For the first time in years he felt something he hadn't dared to feel, hope. But the story didn't end there. The next morning Mark made a decision. He wasn't just going to change, he was going to make amends. He started with his daughter Emma, whom he hadn't spoken to in months. It was a rainy Saturday morning when he stood on her porch, flowers in hand, rehearsing what he would say. The door opened and there she was, her eyes widening in surprise. Dad, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Mark swallowed hard. Emma, I've been a terrible father. I let my grief push you away, and I'm so sorry. I want to fix things if you'll let me. Emma hesitated, her emotions wearing on her face, but then, to Mark's shock, she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. I missed you, she whispered. The floodgates opened, and for the first time in years they began to heal. Word of Mark's transformation began to spread. He resigned from the forced show Ching instead to work with at-risk youth, helping them navigate the struggles he had once ignored. And though the road was long and filled with challenges, he faced it head-on, carrying the lessons he had learned from Keanu. As for Keanu, he continued to live his life with quiet grace, never seeking recognition for the lives he touched. But when he saw Mark on the news months later, speaking to a group of teenagers about the dangers of letting anger consume you, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most unexpected places. Months passed and Mark's life was Unrecognizable each morning he woke up. With purpose, dedicating himself to helping those he once overlooked. He had become a mentor at a youth outreach program offering guidance to kids teetering on the edge of despair. These were children whose stories reminded him of his own, lost, angry, and searching for hope. Despite his progress, the nights were still the hardest. He often lay awake, haunted by memories of his late wife, Susan, and the choices that had driven a wedge between him and his daughter for so long. Emma, though hesitant at first, had slowly begun rebuilding their relationship. Their weekly dinners had become a ritual filled with laughter and stories, but Mark knew he still had a long way to go to earn her trust fully. One evening, while sifting through old belongings in his attic, Mark stumbled upon a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were keepsakes from his marriage, Susan's favorite scarf, letters they'd written to each other, and a framed photo of the three of them at the hospital on that Christmas Eve. He sat there for hours, lost in memories, until his phone buzzed, pulling him back to the present. It was a text from Emma. "Dinner tomorrow. I want to talk about something important." Mark's heart raced. It wasn't like Emma to be vague, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this important conversation would be life-changing. The next evening they met at a small cafe they frequented. Emma was already seated, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her expression unreadable. "Hey sweetheart," Mark said, sliding into the seat across from her. She gave him a small smile but didn't meet his eyes. "Hi Dad." The silence that followed was heavy, and Mark felt a lump forming in his throat. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately, about everything we went through back then, and about you." Mark's chest tightened. "Emma, I know I let you down. I wasn't there when you needed me most, and I'll never stop regretting that." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's not just that, Dad. I've been angry for so long, and I didn't think I'd ever be able to forgive you, but seeing how hard you're trying, how much you've changed, it's made me realize something." Mark leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Emma hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. "I found this while going through Mom's things. It's addressed to you." Mark's hands trembled as he took the envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Susan's. His eyes filled with tears as he carefully opened it and unfolded the letter. Inside, "My dearest Mark, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here. I need you to know how much I loved you, even in the moments when we drifted apart. I saw the pain you carried, the weight you never let anyone else see. You always tried to be strong for us, even when it broke you." But Mark's strength isn't about holding everything inside. It's about letting people in, letting them help carry the load. "Promise me that you won't let the darkness consume you. Promise me you'll fight to find the light again, for yourself and for Emma. You're a good man, Mark. You just need to believe it. With all my love, Susan." Mark's vision blurred as he read the words, his chest heaving with sobs. Emma reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I think she'd be proud of you, Dad," she said softly. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to express the storm of emotions coursing through him. All he could do was hold her hand and hope she felt the depth of his gratitude. That night, as Mark lay in bed, Susan's letter tucked safely under his pillow, he felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of peace. He finally understood what Keanu had meant about forgiveness and redemption. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it and choosing to move forward. But life, as Mark had learned, was never predictable. A few weeks later, Mark received a phone call that would change everything once again. It was Keanu. "I've been thinking about your story," Keanu said, his voice warm but serious. "There's something you should know. It might not be easy to hear, but it's important." Mark's heart raced. "What is it?" Keanu hesitated, then said, "It's about that night at the hospital and what happened afterward. There's a part of the story you don't know." Mark's breath caught in his chest as Keanu's words echoed in his ears. There was more to the story. He gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding. "Keanu, what do you mean? What don't I know?" Keanu paused, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. "I didn't just Help your family that night. Mark 1 was at that hospital for a reason. I've been visiting someone close to me, someone who didn't make it. Mark's mind raced, the weight of Keanu's words settling heavily on his shoulders. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Keanu sighed softly. It was my sister Kim. She was fighting leukemia that night. I was bringing her Christmas gifts, hoping to make her smile, even if only for a little while. But seeing your family, seeing the love you had for Susan and Emma, even in such a difficult moment, it reminded me of why I was there. Your wife's laughter, the way your daughter held her hand, they gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. Mark's throat tightened. He could picture it now, the quiet figure in the corner of that hospital room, his pain hidden behind an easy smile as he handed out gifts. Keanu, I don't even know what to say. I can't believe you were going through something so personal and still found it in you to help us. It wasn't about me, Keanu said simply. It was about doing what I could in that moment. But here's the thing, Mark 1 didn't think much about it afterward. I didn't expect it to change anyone's life, but when I saw you that night on the road, I realized how much pain you were carrying, and it hit me that even the smallest kindness can ripple in ways we don't expect. Mark's eyes burned with tears. You saved my family that night. You gave us a chance to make memories we wouldn't have had otherwise, and now you're helping me see how to put the pieces of my life back together. Keanu's voice softened. You're doing the hard work, Mark. You're making the choice to change, to heal. That's what matters. They spoke for a while longer, the conversation weaving through memories, regrets, and hope. By the time the call ended, Mark felt lighter, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. Days turned into weeks, and Mark threw himself into his work at the outreach center, channeling his energy into helping others. He started sharing his story with the kids he mentored, opening up about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. Slowly but surely he began to see the impact his honesty was having, not just on the kids but on himself. One evening after a particularly long day, Mark returned home to find a package waiting for him. Inside was a book titled Of Kindness, Stories That Change Lives. Tucked inside the front cover was a handwritten note marked, the smallest acts of kindness can leave the deepest marks. Keep paying it forward, Keanu. Mark smiled, his heart full. He placed the book on his nightstand, knowing he'd read it later. For now he sat down and wrote a letter to Susan. My dearest Susan, I'm trying every day. I'm trying to be the man you believed I could be. Emma and I are finding our way back to each other, and I think you'd be proud of her. She's strong, just like you, and though I'll never stop missing you, I finally understand what you meant when you said to find the light again. Thank you for believing in me even when I couldn't. Forever yours, Mark. As he folded the letter and placed it in the box with Susan's keepsakes, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in a long time it was filled with hope, connection, and a promise to make every moment count. And somewhere far away, Keanu Reeves quietly continued his life, knowing that his small act of kindness had helped another soul find its way back to the light.